I grew up next door to a monster. Not the kind with sharp teeth and claws, but the kind that wears an old man's face and lives behind a picket fence. He wasn't just a bad neighbor, he was the kind of person who made every single day feel like a battlefield. And while he thought he could torment us without consequences, what he never knew was that I found a way to make his own rage destroy him from the inside out. If you've ever had that one toxic neighbor who made your life miserable, you're going to feel this story in your bones. Stick around, because by the end, you'll see how sweet, clever revenge can be. And if you love hearing about justice served, hit that like button, subscribe, and let's dive in. When I was a kid, I used to think growing up in a small neighborhood would be like living in one of those warm family sitcoms, neighbors waving at each other, borrowing sugar, summer cookouts with laughter spilling across the lawns. That's what my parents wanted for us when they bought the house. What they didn't know was that right next door lived the kind of man who could take that dream and twist it into a nightmare. He was in his 70s, but don't let that fool you. This man wasn't some frail grandpa. He had this wiry, mean energy, like a rusted spring ready to snap at any second. His face always seemed set in a permanent scowl, as if smiling might crack his skin. From the very first week we moved in, he made it clear that we were the problem family. I remember the first snowfall after we settled in. My sister and I were bundled up, shoveling our driveway, laughing, slipping in the ice. Out of nowhere, he came outside with his shovel. For a split second, I thought maybe he's coming to help. That's what good neighbors do, right? But no. Instead, he scooped up piles of snow and hurled them over the property line, right into the section we had already cleared. He didn't even look at us, just muttered something about lazy kids under his breath at first. I thought, okay, maybe he's just grumpy. Everyone has bad days. But that was just the start. Every spring and summer, it got worse. He would trespass onto our property while we weren't home, trimming our trees without permission. Not because he cared about our yard, but because he hated the way it looked from his side. My mom once came home to find him sawing off branches from the maple in our backyard. She stood there, stunned, watching this old man toss branches onto the ground like he owned the place. When she confronted him, he shrugged and said, "If you won't keep it neat, I will." It didn't stop there. Our lawn was a constant source of his rage. He would scream at us across the fence if he thought the grass was too long, his voice cracking like thunder. And I'll never forget the sick feeling in my stomach when he started watching my sister. She was under 18, out there mowing the grass in the heat of summer, and I could see him standing on his porch, arms folded, eyes glued to her. Not in a way you could easily call the cops for, but in a way that made my skin crawl down my sister. Would come inside afterward, pale and tense, whispering, "He doesn't take his eyes off me." She tried to brush it off, but I could see the way it shook her. She avoided mowing whenever possible, and I couldn't blame her. The worst moment, though the one that burned itself into my memory, was the day he tried to physically fight us. It was during another winter, shoveling again. He stormed across his yard like a bull, his boots pounding against the snow, his face red with fury. He was yelling nonsense, accusing us of stealing snow from in front of his house, as if the snow itself belonged to him. Before I knew it, he was charging at us. I was young, but adrenaline surged through me. I clenched my fists, planted my feet in the snow, and I yelled, "Take one more step and I'll drop you." For a moment, it was like time froze. He stopped just a few feet away, breathing heavy, nostrils flaring. His eyes locked on mine, and I swear, if I hadn't stood my ground, he would have swung at me. The police were called that day. Sirens, flashing lights, officers asking questions. And yet nothing happened. No charges, no consequences. Just another report that disappeared into a filing cabinet. That was the moment I realized something. The system wasn't going to protect us from this man. If anything was going to change, if there was going to be any justice, it would have to come from me, but I didn't know how not yet. All I knew was that every time he glared at us, every time he opened his mouth to spit venom, every time he made my sister uncomfortable, the anger in me grew hotter and hotter until it wasn't just frustration anymore. It was a promise, Dot, and eventually an opportunity for revenge landed in my lap, one that was so subtle, so deliciously ironic. It would haunt him for years without him ever knowing who was behind it. For a while, after that showdown in the snow, I thought maybe things would calm down. Maybe him seeing me stand up would be enough. Maybe he'd snarl and retreat and our lives would return to normal. That was wishful thinking, dangerously so. The truth was the opposite. Standing up to him didn't cow him. It provoked him. It fed the fire. The weeks that followed felt like living inside an old wound that kept getting picked at. I started waking up to the sound of his voice before my alarm, low and scathing, like someone scraping a bowl with a fork. He had a way of making ordinary sounds feel malicious. The clack of his cane on the porch stairs, the rattle of his windows when he slammed them, the radio he played too loud at odd hours tuned to nothing but blasted opinions and static. My chest tightened every time any of those noises crept in. My parents tried to be calm about it at first. He's old, he's set in his ways, he doesn't mean half of what he says, my mom would tell me, smoothing the towel over a dish as if the motion could iron out the tautness in our days. My dad, whose patience had its own limits, would mutter about speaking to him, but words back then were flimsy shields. The man was relentless. He escalated with petty, targeted annoyances that had a sting precisely because they were so childish. He'd cut across our lawn with his push mower at dawn, spraying clippings into the air like confetti aimed at our windows. He'd leave cigarette butts along our walkway even though none of us smoked. Once, he lined his fence with small mirrors and positioned them so the sun's glare ricocheted into our kitchen windows at a maddening angle while we ate breakfast. It sounds almost cartoonish, the kind of thing a grumpy old neighbor in a sitcom would do, and maybe that's what made it worse. He made cruelty feel banal. Every day, normalized. There were nights I lay awake and cataloged these slights, in my head like evidence, rehearsing how I would present them if there were ever a single person left who would listen and act. I'd list dates and times, replay his words in a whisper so I could feel them again. I wanted to make the injustice real, to prove to myself that it was not in my head. But the problem was never a lack of facts. The problem was that no one cared enough to do anything about them. The world had rules for paperwork, for courtrooms, for police reports, but when Mean lived in the space between pages and precincts, the rules didn't help. The psychological weight of it got heavier. You don't notice the accumulation of small cruelties until they begin to shape the way you move through the world. I caught myself calculating routes through the yard to avoid the windows that faced his porch. I timed chores to avoid him. I found myself answering the door with the intent look I'd seen on witnesses and news reports, polite, wary, neutral. Even laughter felt dangerous. I learned to stifle it in case some inhuman eyebrow from the fence line might find it offensive. My sister tried to be brave. She insisted on mowing the lawn sometimes, though her hands would shake and the mower would roar like a beast she could barely control. Once, after she finished, she walked back into the house without looking at us and leaned against the pantry door, and her voice trembled when she said, "I thought he was going to come over the fence and grab the mower from me." The image of that old man lunging across the grass, of his face folded into wrongness, lodged in my chest. It was a cold, constant thing that didn't thaw. When the police matter fizzled earlier, it didn't make him back down, it emboldened him. There's a particular kind of arrogance that comes from knowing you've gotten away with something. It's heavier than guilt and faster than conscience. He began to treat our family like a joke, like a recurring amusement. He'd gather his buddies on his porch and point out our house while we were outside, like we were an exhibit he enjoyed. Once, as I walked past, one of them shouted something crude about my sister. He laughed. He didn't intervene. He encouraged it. I tried to talk to my parents about escalation, quiet conversations in the kitchen between the clink of mugs. I suggested cameras. My dad shook his head. "We're not the type to make a fuss," he said. But my mom, who'd had more than enough, finally relented in a way that showed me the rusted core of her patience had been cracked. She bought motion sensor lights and installed them herself in the dead of night, fingers numb and stubborn. It was a small victory. It was also a confession. We'd been living with fear long enough to take ourselves down into secret measures. There were moments of almost ridiculousness that strained my sanity. He once left a stack of offensive flyers at our mailbox. Flyers printed with a maniac's neat font and a list of rules, as if our family had broken some ancient covenant. My mother gathered them up and threw them out, but I kept one, folding it into my pocket until I could burn it in the grill out back. Only the act of lightness made me feel better, that and the sly, childish pleasure of seeing smoke lick the letters until they faltered. But then came something more sinister, the story about his wife. A whispered rumor at a neighborhood barbecue was the first time I heard it. People don't gossip like they used to. They gossip in small, careful sentences now, full of evasions and heresy. But the words reached me. He had a temper that didn't stop at words. He had been abusive to her. The rumor hardened into truth when an ambulance once appeared at his house, red lights painting the mid-afternoon like bad confetti. I watched from across the street as a paramedic carried a limp figure down the stairs. The old man's face was blank, or maybe it was blank with a camouflage of some darker thing. He didn't cry. He didn't run. He did nothing that the world might expect a human to do when confronted with the wreckage of their life. Eventually, there were court dates. I don't know every detail. Adults had a way of cutting off the finer points to shield us, but I knew the gist. He'd crossed a line that even the system couldn't shove off. He went away for a time. The neighborhood breathed differently when he wasn't there. Birds seemed to alight on the phone lines in a less wary way. The pause was a relief, an inhale, but relief is tricky. It makes you forget how to be vigilant, and it makes the return sting harder. When he came back from prison, he came back smaller in some ways and tighter in others. The anger had been tempered by the walls, and it came out in subtler, meaner ways. If before he'd screamed, now he simmered. If before he'd charged, now he prowled. It felt like he'd learned how to be cruel without getting arrested again. That's when the little victories I'd scribbled in my head had to turn into something more than notes. The nights I'd lay awake cataloging his behavior suddenly felt like preparation. I started paying attention to the patterns of his days. He had routines, the radio at 6:15, the yard work at 9, the nap with blackout curtains at 2:30. There was a rhythm to how he existed, and rhythms are maps for anyone who wants to navigate someone else's life. But even with patterns, there were mistakes. I tried one early gambit that felt brave in the moment and foolish in retrospect. I taped our own security footage to a door and waited, thinking the evidence would make the point we needed. The footage showed him cutting our branches, sure enough. It showed him standing outside our fence, hands on hips, scowling. It showed his face up close, the knotted mouth, the chipped tooth. I took the tape to the local precinct and waited, hands folded like a petitioner. The officer who took it looked bored. "We'll file it," he said. "But without more than one incident or immediate threat, there isn't much we can do." He shrugged and handed the tape back like it was a library book. The feeling of being dismissed burned in my throat. That dismissal fermented into something darker. Inside me, a sense that I was alone in defending my family. It gave me permission, in the small way grudges give permission, to think about other methods. It wasn't just about knocking him down. It was about reclaiming a sense of safety we'd lost. It was about telling the world, in whatever small way I could, that you don't get to make someone's life a game this way. But with the idea came doubt. I had flashes at night, sinister, intoxicating flashes of the perfect revenge. I would wake with an image still sharp in my mind, the taste of it like metal. Then, in the light, my rational brain would climb over it, reminding me of consequences. What if it backfired? What if it made things worse for my family? The fear of escalation mixed with the desire for reprisal until my stomach was a churning ocean. I told myself I wouldn't do anything stupid. I told myself I'd find a way that was clever, surgical, nonviolent. I tried to test my own boundaries. There was a night I cut the string of his mailbox flag so it wouldn't stay up when he thought there was mail, just to see the reaction. It was petty. It was childish. It felt good. The next morning, the flag was back up and a note had been scribbled on a pad. Don't touch my mail. The all caps was the adult version of a taunt. I wanted to laugh and then I wanted to throw up. The exchange had become a conversation conducted entirely in spite. Meanwhile, inside the house, the tension made family dinners into strategic operations. We'd time our comings and goings, whispering about window shades and back steps and the many ways you can make the mundane obey your will. My sister went through cycles of bravado and retreat. There were days she would glare across the yard and dare him to say something. And then there were days she would lock the door and press her forehead to the window pane like she was trying to push her courage out through the glass. Those were the hardest nights for me because the person I wanted to protect most was this sister who tried to be small and big at the same time. School and work became the only places that felt normal. At my job, people talked about the heat and the clock and nothing heavy. Their casualness made my nerves feel tinny, like a radio off frequency. I couldn't explain why minor things made me jerk. A car backfiring would send my pulse surging. A neighbor's dog barking put me on edge. I was living on a hair trigger of preparedness, and the cumulative stress twisted me into a version of myself I didn't like. Then something odd happened that pushed me over the edge and into dangerous curiosity. I started getting unsolicited pamphlets in my mailbox, not the religious stuff. Not yet, but mailers for various community services, neighborhood watch announcements, informational pamphlets about safety. Innocuous, useful things. A neighborly voice saying, "Pay attention." I didn't know who was sending them. And my mind did what my mind does when it's hungry for patterns. I filled the blanks. One night, after another petty provocation from him, pouring soapy water into our bird bath, as if to watch the birds leave in disgust, I sat on the back steps with my head in my hands. The house smelled of dinner and bleach and small domestic peace. Under the porch light, the world narrowed to the boxy shape of the mail slot. I thought of the months people had laughed about the monster next door over barbecues, of the officer who had shrugged, of my sister's hands trembling after mowing. And then I heard it, the subtle, infuriating click of his porch light coming on. The night felt like a held breath. If something in me had a voice loud enough to speak then, it would have said, "Enough." I didn't know at that moment what enough looked like. I only knew it made the hairs on my arms stand up and my jaw clench. I sat there until the porch light went off and a car drove by and the world rolled on as if nothing had happened. And yet everything had changed. The calculus in my head shifted from reactive to deliberate. I was no longer cataloging injuries. I was beginning to consider options. That night I started making lists, not vengeful fantasies, but practical notes. Times of day, when his curtains were drawn, when his garbage went out, Who else in the neighborhood kept odd hours? What made him leave the house? I drew maps on scrap paper, markers of routine and habit. It felt absurd and a little frightening, like learning a language you didn't want to know. But knowledge felt like a tool, and toolness was the opposite of helplessness. By the time the sun rose, my lists were longer and my head was buzzing with possibilities. I didn't yet have a plan. I only had a direction. If no one else would hold him accountable, I would find a way to make his life unbearable in a way the law never could, without breaking the law myself. I wanted him to feel the small humiliations he had inflicted on us multiplied 100-fold. I wanted him to see strangers at his door with patient smiles. I wanted the thing he loved, his control over the neighborhood, to slip through his fingers, but plotting revenge is a dangerous intoxicant. It makes you imagine yourself as a playwright, directing outcomes and movements. It makes you see people as actors in your drama. And the bloodless, precise planning I began to enjoy was not always noble. There were nights I woke convinced that any humiliation I could devise would be justified. Morality is elastic when you're trying to fit the shape of your pain into something sensible. The turning point wasn't a single event so much as a slow tilt toward boldness. It was the realization that the man hated two things more than anything: being ignored and being confronted with what he despised, religious folks, specifically Jehovah's Witnesses. He would light up with fury if someone knocked on his door carrying a pamphlet about faith. He hated their persistence and their refusal to be cowed. He hated being told no politely. That dislike had a texture to it I could almost feel. It was the way his jaw clenched when an unwelcome truth was placed in his path, and that was the thought that kept me awake the night before I finally acted. Not violent, not public, something sharp, personal, and wildly subtle. Something that would poke at his nerves in a place the law couldn't reach. I had stumbled on an idea that felt equal parts petty and poetic. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I felt the old fear intrude. What if he noticed the pattern? What if he suspected me? What if it made things worse for my family? The list of consequences loomed like a ledger. I thought of the nights my sister had pressed her forehead to the glass. I thought of my mother who had started carrying her keys as if they were weapons. I thought of the officer who had shrugged at evidence. That memory hardened into resolve. The next morning, I walked out with pockets full of envelopes and a quiet plan growing like a seed, a plan that would, if it worked, make him explode in ways not even the police could intervene. But I didn't yet know the smallest detail that would make it inevitable. I didn't yet know how close I was to crossing the line between cleverness and cruelty. I only knew the map I'd drawn in the night, patterns, openings, and the thin, thrilling sense of being in control for the first time in years. And then, as I slid the first envelope toward the mailbox, my hand froze. Because in the distance, behind the blinds of his window, a shadow moved. It was too early for his routine. Too early for visitors. The shadow wasn't alone. Someone stepped out onto his porch, not the old man, but someone else I did not expect. The shape of a figure stood there, small and patient, and the way they held themselves was like a question. For a second, everything halted. The possibility of consequence turned from abstract to immediate. My heart sped up. The envelope felt suddenly heavier than a rock in my pocket. I had wanted to be clever. I had not imagined being watched the instant I started. The porch light clicked on. The shadow lifted its head. My breath fogged in the cold air as a first. Sharp realization cut through me. I wasn't the only one thinking. And I didn't yet know if that was good or very, very bad. For a few beats, I simply stood on the porch step, feeling foolish and exposed, the envelope still warm in my hand from having been gripped too long. The shadow on his porch straightened and stepped back into the dim. I blinked hard, trying to pull myself from the tiny spiral of panic that wanted to tell me I'd been seen, that my amateur maps and careful timings had been useless. Then I noticed something that made the color drain from the world. The shape on his porch wasn't a person coming to meet him. It was a Bible tucked under an arm, an umbrella, and a pamphlet stick out that glinted white in the low light. It was one of them, a pair of people in plain jackets, faces set in that patient, professional calm that makes someone who hates persistence see red. For a second, I felt a ridiculous soaring triumph, like a kid who'd discovered candy hidden in the pantry. My first plan had not been clever at all. It had been dumb luck. The first pamphlet I'd slid into the mailbox that morning, the one I'd almost dropped as if it were a hot coal, had been a bait I had no right to call deliberate. Someone else had chosen the same weapon without my involvement. For a half-second, I wanted to laugh and cry at once. Then the old man's front door swung open and the cold night air was punctured by the sound of his voice. "What do you want?" He snapped, and the way he spat the words made every syllable a cut. "We're here just to talk about the kingdom," the man on the porch said, and even in the dark I could see his hand reach for the pamphlet at his chest. "Good evening, sir. We just wanted to share some information." The old man's face had that red, pulpy look it had when someone had stepped on his pride. He folded his arms and leaned his weight into the doorframe like it gave him authority. "I don't want your religion," he said. "I don't want your nonsense. Get off my porch." "We understand, sir," the woman said. "If you'd like, we could come back at another time." "No," he cut her off. "You'll leave now. Don't ever come back." The words were an order, a rusty command issued to someone with the power of age. The two left, murmuring their practiced, patient condolences. I watched them move down his path and across the street, polite and unhurried. Their footsteps like A-M-A-T-R-O-N-O-M-E dot in my chest, something loud and ancient pounded. A child's delight and an adult's relief braided together. That night, the old man had been made to do something he despised. He'd had to stand there and say no, to tell someone politely and firmly to leave his porch. It was a tiny wound, but wounds have a way of awakening. From that moment, the plan found me like a tide finding a shore. Not just because he hated religion, though that was the seed, but because he hated being told no by polite persistence. He squirmed when something he considered ridiculous refused to be chased away with abuse. I realized then that there was a way to turn his world into the very thing that made him crumble. Other people showing up. Again and again, unbothered by his fury, polite beyond reason, unmoved by threats. I didn't have their training. I couldn't marshal a team of strangers to my cause without hospitality and a lot of explanation. What I could do was push buttons that made strangers come to him, phone calls, emails, church directories, public forums, tiny triggers that set other people in motion. It was anonymous, it was legal, and it hit the exact nerve I wanted to press. So I began to study them the way I had studied his routine. I learned the times local ministries held open houses. I watched online boards where community volunteers signed up for outreach. I found email lists and public contact forums and, almost too easily, the same handful of phone numbers that showed up when I searched for a local religious, outreach, and door-to-door ministry. Some of the numbers were published by groups I'd never heard of. Some were tiny, earnest churches that ran on volunteers with full-time jobs. The brittle part of me wanted to feel something like remorse, but I swallowed it down and called anyway. Calling, I discovered, was a small theater of voices. There were voices that made the air feel heavier, some carefully rehearsed, some genuine and small and human. I'd learned how to speak in a way that sounded like someone who genuinely wanted to help. "Hi, I'm calling because I think my neighbor would appreciate a visit," I'd say. And then quickly add a plausible detail, a name, a time when he'd be home, a little lie that felt more like a costume than a betrayal. Most of the time, they asked polite follow-ups, the kind that make you feel like you're doing something helpful. I'd give him a bare minimum, an address, a preferred afternoon, and a gentle insistence that no, he doesn't want to be disturbed, but sometimes that's when people have the most to say. They'd note it down, thank me, and hang up. Emailing felt more powerful because it left a trace. I could craft a message that looked earnest. Hello, I'm part of a small ministry and we're looking to reach folks in the neighborhood. We think Mr. Surname might enjoy a visit. He seems like someone who could use a friendly conversation about life and faith. The truth was, I didn't know his surname for sure. I'd once heard it from a mailbox, but I researched the rest. It was not hard. The internet is a ledger of public information for people who are determined. Sometimes I used forums that let me stay anonymous. Other times I used throwaway email addresses. At first it felt like cheating, the way a spy would feel in a movie, ingenious and wicked at the same time. But as the calls accumulated and the visits began, I experienced something stranger than triumph, a quiet, surgical satisfaction. Each ring of his doorbell was a small argument won. Not everything went smoothly. There were moments that nearly ruined everything. Once, a woman from a church organization called me back to verify the address. Her voice was bright and kind and curious, the kind of voice that assumes people are good. I stumbled. I made up a name, then stammered when she asked if I'd like to be present when they visited. For a whole minute, I felt the old panic claw at my throat. I lied. I said I had to work, that it wasn't convenient, that I only wanted to help. She thanked me and hung up. Another time, a volunteer knocked on our own door, mistakenly having been told that our family was part of a community check-in. My mom answered and invited them in for tea, because that's what she is. They sat at our kitchen table and talked about outreach programs and Sunday lessons, while my mother nodded and smiled. I watched the whole scene through the living room window, heart thudding like a drum. The woman who led them looked at our photos on the mantle with a polite curiosity, and then, with the softest possible tone, said, "It's so important to be patient with folks who might push back." My cheeks warmed. I wanted to climb into her lap and confess everything. But instead, I sat very still and let the plan continue to unfurl. The strangest part of all this was how normal it began to feel. There were days when the house rang with doorbells and people on his porch, and he would come out and storm and shout in full voice until he was hoarse. There were mornings when our windows were rattled by polite singing, afternoons when a toddler's squeal outside his gate sent him stomping to the fence. He paced, he fumed. He hung up signs on his door like talismans. But he couldn't stop them. There was a satisfaction so precise I could taste it when he had to repeat the humiliation of telling strangers to leave. They called him by his name. They spoke to him like a person in need of care, not as the villain he thought he was. My internal life during that time was a constant oscillation between glee and horror. I would stand at the kitchen island with my coffee and feel very small and very large at the same time. Small because I had done this anonymously and had to hide behind the polite mask of volunteer collar. Large because I had created a ripple that struck where the world's formal systems had failed. Guilt would creep in occasionally, a sharp little animal reminding me that the old man had rights too, and that my actions, while legal, were still meant to unsettle someone. But then he would fling a stack of flyers at my mother's feet or step into our yard and breathe in our air like he owned it. And the guilt would scuttle back into the corner until I saw his face again and felt my resolve harden. There were close calls that tightened my throat. Once his neighbor, a woman named Carol, who hated trouble and liked things tidy, came to our door with a complaint. "He says he's getting a lot of visits," she said quietly, looking at our faces. "He thinks people are being nosy about him." Is everything okay? I swallowed and lied again, said I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. She nodded slowly and left with her hands clasped like a prayer. That night I imagined the grimace on his face, picturing him pacing and muttering about conspiracies. And the picture pleased me in a private, childish way, as the visits multiplied. So did the small innovations in the plan. Sometimes I would sign up for a community outreach list and forward an event reminder to 20 different groups, each time adding his address as a plausible destination. Other times I'd leave pamphlets in the little free libraries around town with a tiny note inside. Visit Mr. H, he'd like a chat. People are helpful by nature. They like to be useful. I learned to make usefulness a trap. The more I learned about the rhythms of volunteer networks, the more I could nudge them without leaving fingerprints. The emotional texture of my life changed in ways I hadn't predicted. I began to feel like a conductor at an orchestra where only one sour note mattered. When a knock came and I heard his muttered horror as he recognized the voice of someone with a hymn, the sensation that ran through me was not simply relief. It was the purest release I had felt since everything started. There was something almost ritual in it. A wound opened and then somehow cleaned. Of course, not every reaction was dramatic. Sometimes the volunteers were gentle and left quickly, their polite smiles lingering like band-aids over something raw. He'd grumble and close the door, and I'd feel the sting of anticlimax. It made me crave a harder wound, a crack that would widen into a break. That craving should have been a warning sign, but like a fever, it encouraged me to push further. Then came a day when my plan intersected with one of his darkest secrets. I'd always known, in a vague, whispered way, that his marriage had been terrible. The ambulance, the murmurs, the courthouse notice, pieces knotted together into something ugly. I'd never wanted to use that. I'd wanted my revenge to be clever and rightful, not cruel in the way of exposing private pain. But one afternoon I overheard him in a full, seething conversation on the phone that cut through my window pane like a blade. "I told you," he barked. "I paid for my time. I served my sentence. Doesn't mean I want any of that showing up here." His words were clipped. His voice had the brittle quality of someone whose privacy was an armor. The line he spoke to continued, "They shouldn't come to my door. What are you, crazy?" He was talking about people from a support group. Of all things, advocates for victims, volunteers who help those who survived domestic abuse. He was furious because a woman from the group had come by, quietly leaving information in his mailbox about getting help. He swore and called them liars and fools. Hearing him deny the help in such a tone turned something simmering in me into a full flame. If he hated being confronted with kindness and help that he tried to crush in his own house, then sending help to his doorstep in forms he couldn't control would be the penultimate humiliation. The idea shocked me because of its sharpness. The volunteers from those groups were not evangelical. They were quietly professional, trained to speak to survivors and their abusers with care. They weren't there to proselytize. They were there to hold up a mirror of consequences and possibilities. The thought of them standing at his porch, patient and unflinching, made my pulse quicken. It seemed perversely like justice, not the showy vengeance of payback, but the slow societal reckoning he had so deftly evaded in the past. But this required more than anonymous emails. It required a different kind of manipulation, the kind that bordered on steering a bus toward someone without being the driver. It required that I become small and invisible and influential at the same time. I wrote letters, not forged, but persuasive, to neighborhood coalitions and local outreach programs, describing a worried neighbor who might be resistant to help, but could nevertheless benefit from a visit. I phrased everything with care, tempering righteous anger with the language of concern. In the margins of my notes, I scribbled little clarifications. He has a history. He is defensive. He will likely be hostile. The language felt clinical, like a case file I was building. The weeks that followed were a tangle of teeth-clenching anticipation and near-miss terror. One night, as I sat in my parked car across the street, watching his porch like it was an altar, I saw a volunteer from one group walk up his path in the twilight. He was a woman in a teal jacket, carrying a small satchel. As she reached for the knob, the old man flung the door wide and began to shout. Her voice stayed steady. She smiled with the kind of softness that is practice, not instinct. He told her to leave. She said she was only there to offer resources. He threatened to call the police. She wrote down her number and left it tucked in his mail slot. From my car. Seeing him recoil like that felt like watching someone flinch at a memory. I wanted to shout with victory, but instead sat very still until my hands stopped shaking. The feeling was complicated. It was triumph dipped in sorrow. I had managed to orchestrate a truth he refused to own. And yet, in the middle of it all, there was a human being who had been hurt by more than my scheming. The closer I got, the more the edges of my morality blurred. I had begun with the intention to make him uncomfortable, to strike back at the petty cruelties and the small brutalities. But now I had an entire web of outreach people, caseworkers and volunteers ringing his doorbell, leaving literature and calling him with the gentle persistence he found intolerable. It was work that, in some abstract sense, did good. It also felt like punishment. I told myself the difference was that I wasn't exposing him to harm. I was exposing him to consequences, if only social and emotional. But conscience is a tricky barometer. It tweaks and twitches and sometimes goes silent when your wounds are loudest, and yet, even wrestled with guilt, there was no turning back. I had seen the way he crumpled at the sight of patient visitors. I had felt the community begin to notice a pattern. People he'd previously bullied now exchanged glances about that man, and in the way neighbors do, small alliances formed. My mother, who had once refused to make a fuss, began to write down times he'd crossed lines. She never knew I had been the architect of the visits, but in some small way, my actions let her feel less alone. The plan matured into a ritual. I would make a series of calls on certain days, send gentle, anonymous notes on others, and once in a while, sign up for an event under a fake volunteer name, not to go, but to ensure someone would. Each action was a small flicker of rebellion. Each knock he answered was a flicker of triumph. I was not naive enough to imagine the plan would end with a single dramatic collapse. Real life rarely gives you that Hollywood moment. No, what I wanted, and what began to happen piece by piece, was the slow unraveling of his certainty that he could be the judge of his street forever. I wanted the neighborhood to become a mirror. I wanted him to taste the patience and the persistence he despised. Over and over, until his certainty cracked. One late autumn evening, after weeks of orchestrated knocks and visits, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug that had gone cold. My hand hovered over the list of upcoming calls, and my thumb traced each name like a small prayer. On the floor, my sister's sneakers squeaked as she paced, the noise like a metronome for my anxiety. My father sat opposite, reading the paper with a focus that made the rest of the room feel fragile. Then, like a cliff that had been climbed too slowly, the house shook with a single, decisive knock, 3 hard, insistent raps that sounded like a gavel. It echoed through the room and cut off whatever fragile calm we'd built. My heart leaped into my throat. For a moment, I thought it was one of the volunteers arriving at our own door again. But then a second knock came, the same pattern, and then a voice outside. Unmistakable, low, and controlled. This is community support. We need to speak with Mr. H. It's urgent. We all went still. The air felt electric. My sister's hand found mine under the table. My father folded his paper with slow, careful motions. I realized with a cold clarity that the plan had reached a point of no return. The wave I had set in motion had become a force of its own, and whatever came next would be irreversible. I stood, listening to the footsteps on the porch, as if the sound could tell me whether the next move would be triumph or disaster. I wanted to be brave. I wanted to be invisible. My mouth was dry. My mind kept writing the same prayer in a loop. Please let this end the way it should. The door opened from the outside. A voice I didn't recognize, professional, not religious, said, "We're here to make sure he's okay. He has a history we're concerned about." There was a pause. Then the old man's answer, muffled, furious, and very human, "Get off my property." This time the voice on the porch did not back down. The front door clicked shut, the sound of his retreat like something folding in on itself. Through the curtained window, I could see him move. The shape of his back bent in a way that made me both breathless and terrified. The volunteers spoke in low tones, then louder, then with the steady cadence of people who had training and patience in a cause. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass and watched the scene like someone watching a glassblower at work, waiting to see whether the piece would hold or shatter. The neighborhood had always been a stage of small dramas. Tonight felt like the opening of something bigger, a reckoning that would not be resolved by my cleverness alone. And then, in the middle of it, someone on the porch said his name aloud, full and clear, a name I had whispered in my calls but never heard in person. The sound of it landed in the backyard like a verdict. I felt something inside me lean forward. The hour had come to see whether the plan would do what I dreamed of, to humble him, to crack his certainty, and to give us back a kind of quiet we'd been denied. But as the volunteers' voices rose and the old man's retorts grew, another thought struck me like a cold hand at the base of my skull. I had no idea how he would react when his past met people whose job it was not to be cowed by him. I had built a careful, patient trap. Now the animal in the cage had been rattled. From the kitchen window, I watched the porch light pool across the walkway and waited for the sound that would tell me if the night was ending in triumph or disaster. A scream, a slam, an ambulance, siren, or the soft folding of a defeated man admitting he had been wrong. The sound that came first was neither. It was the old man's voice, muffled but not completely swallowed. "You don't understand," he said, and then he laughed in a way that made my skin prickle. That laugh was a jagged thing, half denial, half defiance. The volunteers answered calmly, and the conversation continued. But as I stood there, the excitement in my chest was threaded with a tremor of fear. This was no longer an experiment. This was a turning point. I took a breath, braced myself, and stepped away from the window, the way you step away from the edge of a cliff right before the drop. When I stepped away from the window that night, the sound of voices on the porch swelled and receded like tidewater. I told myself to breathe, to keep my face calm, to be the adult who had orchestrated this theater without ever joining the cast. My hands still shook when I reached for the doorknob. The house felt too small and too loud at the same time. I could hear my heart in my ears, the thump like a second, secret drumbeat that had been with me for months. Then my father's chair scraped back. He walked to the front room and stood with his palm on the glass, watching. My sister came up behind him and pressed her forehead to the pane, the outline of her breath fogging the window. I remember the exact way the light pulled on the hardwood. Floor then, a warm ellipse in a room that had been cold for too long. Outside, the voices continued. I couldn't catch all the words, but the cadence had changed. It was no longer just polite insistence. The volunteers were professional now, their sentences laced with the precise phrases of people trained to handle. Resistance. We're concerned for his safety. We're here to offer resources. We'll wait while you speak with him. Each line they said felt like a chisel stroke, gentle but unrelenting. Then the old man emerged. His shoulders rolled forward like someone carrying an invisible weight. He had on that same scowl, as if it were stitched to his face. When he stepped onto the porch, the first thing I noticed was how small he looked, not physically smaller, but diminished, stripped of the theatrical menace he used to wear. Maybe it was the way the night lit him, or maybe it was the fact he was facing people who wouldn't be cowed. What is this? He barked, and it came out a little thinner than I expected. The sound scraped the air. We've had reports, the lead volunteer said calmly, that you might need some support. We just wanted to check in. Support? He snorted. I don't need your... He caught himself. For a second, his mouth twisted into something like confusion. Leave now. One of the volunteers, a man with a slow, even voice, stepped forward. Mr. H, we're not here to bother you. We're trained to help in situations like... He cut them off with a laugh that sounded brittle and dangerous. You lot don't know me. You don't know what I'm made of. I don't want your help. His fingers dug into the doorframe. The muscles in his jaw worked like a trap being tightened. The woman in the teal jacket put her hand up in a pacifying gesture. We understand your boundaries. We can leave. But we wanted to give you this. Information in case. She extended a small card, the kind with phone numbers and times for support meetings. He snatched it from her hand like it burned. The action was so quick and so primal it jolted the scene. For a moment, everything felt dangerously close to breaking. Then his voice, low, flat, touched something inside him that sounded like memory. He muttered a name. It might have been his wife's. The name landed like gravel in the road. The lead volunteer didn't flinch. Instead, he offered a soft, even sentence. If you ever want to talk, Mr. H, we're here. No judgment. Just resources. That was the line that got under his skin. I saw it in the little hitch of his shoulders, the way his eyes darted, the twitch at his temple. For a heartbeat, there was human fragility where there had always been only rage. Then, as if rehearsed, the old man did something I had seen him do 100 times at the fence. He shouted and he ordered them away. He used the same vocabulary of ownership and law. He accused. He called them names. But there was a tremor beneath the fury now, a flinch like a man who'd been struck in a place that still ached. The volunteers didn't raise their voices. They wrote something on a pad, and when they left a phone number in his mailbox, they didn't slam the door. They folded the offer of help and retreated as if they had placed a seed on the earth. It felt triumphal in its quietness after they left. He slammed the door with a violence that rattled our windows. For a few long minutes, the neighborhood seemed to exhale. My sister and I stood at the window, heads close together, watching the porch light flare and then go out. We both laughed, a short, brittle sound that had nothing of celebration in it. It was relief, yes, but it was also the recognition that the battle was far from over. Over the next days, the visits continued. Sometimes they were religious groups returning. Sometimes they were home care nurses checking on him. Sometimes they were volunteers from the domestic abuse support group dropping informational pamphlets. Each arrival set him off in a different way. One afternoon, he stepped into his yard and screamed so loudly that the mail carrier, who'd always been polite in his way, looked startled and moved faster down the path. The old man began to pace, muttering to himself, his hands flapping at his sides in pantomime. Neighbors noticed. There were whispered conversations over hedges and at bus stops. People who had once kept their silence started passing remarks about keeping an eye on each other. Carol, the tidy neighbor, started leaving casseroles on porches for people who seemed frazzled. My mother slowly began to breathe easier. She straightened the cushions on the porch and kept her smile for folks who stopped to ask how she was holding up. Word also reached the precinct. An officer I'd seen before, the one who had taken the tape months earlier, came by our house to ask questions. He was more attentive this time, perhaps because there were now multiple complaints about the old man's behavior. Perhaps because the volunteers were reporting someone who was volatile and had a record. He asked about dates and times, about threats, and as he left, he told my parents that they were not alone. It felt like a small victory of the formal world finally catching up, belated and cautious, but the old man was not a passive figure in the drama. He felt back in the only language he had left, rumor and intimidation and public posturing. He started putting up signs on his lawn, hand-lettered messages about privacy and false accusations. He took to standing at his window with binoculars like some grotesque amusement. He stirred his friends to whisper and gossip and tilt the scale of neighborhood opinion. It was the old playbook: make noise, sow doubt, erode the solidarity forming against you. Then the call came that made my hands go numb. I was at work when my sister texted. They took him away. The message was small and flat, and it felt like a physical strike. My phone buzzed again. A neighbor had called the Adult Protective Services line. Reports had accumulated. Volunteers had documented visits and his reactions. The officers had gone to his home on a welfare check, and after talking with him and noting the signs, bruises, pills piled in odd places. Defensive answers? They called for paramedics who determined there were reasons to involve social services. There was also a report they'd filed about his history, plus the whispered accounts from the support group. The authorities had acted on the pattern that months of anonymous calls had created. When I went home that evening, the house felt different, lighter in some ways, but with an undercurrent I couldn't name. There were police cars, quiet and professional, parked a respectful distance down the street. People avoided the house as if it were a wound they didn't want to touch. My sister held my hand so tight it hurt. I had expected a different feeling, perhaps the swift, cinematic satisfaction movies promise. Instead, I felt hollowed out, as if the stone I'd been carrying had finally been set down but had left a dent in my hands. There was triumph, yes. The man who had made our lives unbearable was being taken away from our immediate orbit. But there was also sorrow, because he was still a human being with a wrecked life, and because the unspooling of his ruin involved people wounds and systems, not just a private victory dot in the weeks that followed. The conversation in the neighborhood shifted. Some people praised what had happened, saying finally the problem was being dealt with. Others whispered that perhaps things had been taken too far. The truth, of course, lay between. The man had a past that involved hurting someone he once vowed to love. He had a capacity for cruelty that could not be excused. At the same time, the string of anonymous nudges I'd orchestrated had contributed to the official attention that removed him from the street. It felt like both justice and complicity braided together. My parents were cautious about celebrating. My mother wrote him a note, a small neutral thing, wishing him well and saying she hoped he would find peace. She wasn't asking for revenge. She was asking for an end to fear. When she told me about it, I understood that she had claimed the moral high ground for her family. I admired her for it more than I can explain. As for me, the emotional release I had craved arrived in strange, small ways. I walked through the yard one morning and felt the grass under my shoes without looking over at his house. I watched my sister mow the lawn without flinching. There were nights I slept without the sudden spike of adrenaline that had become my default. Those small freedoms felt enormous. They were the real currency of what I'd been trying to buy, the right to live without being pestered, ogled, or threatened, but the aftermath did not make me untouchable. There were nights when I would wake and replay scenes, not with the clarity of triumph, but with the foggy guilt of someone who'd set events in motion. I thought about his laughter the night the volunteers first came. I thought about the tremor in his voice when his past was named. I thought about the human architecture of shame and denial. Did my anonymous calls teach him humility, or did they push him closer to the edge, forcing an unspooling that no one had wanted to be public. It's the question that kept me up sometimes, a burr under the tongue. Over time, the neighborhood healed in fits and starts. People did casseroles. They picked up each other's mail when folks were away. The commune of small houses across the street started to hum with neighborliness again, the kind my parents had once imagined when they bought the house. My family began to laugh more easily at the dinner table. My sister's shoulders relaxed. My mother stopped checking the driveway every time a car turned onto the street. Those practical, mundane recoveries were the victory, yet the final act of the story was quieter than I expected. One afternoon, months later, a woman from the support group knocked on our door. She did not carry a folder this time. Instead, she came with a small, polite envelope. She asked to speak with my mother and, after a while, left. When she walked away, my mother closed the door and slid the envelope across the kitchen table as though it were delicate. Inside was a short note. Thank you. We could not have reached him without people who were willing to speak, people who cared enough to notice. There was no triumph in the note, no savage pleasure, just the pragmatic, blunt truth that intervention is a community act. I thought then about the nature of revenge and justice. They are cousins with similar faces. One burns for personal satisfaction, the other needs wronging to right. In the end, what I'd wanted was not to make someone suffer for the sake of cruelty, but to remove the corrosive influence he had on our lives. The method I'd chosen was not perfect. Maybe it was messy. Maybe it was ethically compromised. But it worked in the way small acts sometimes do, not with a single thunderbolt, but with repeated, patient pressure until something surrendered. The old man did not become a cautionary tale in the way I'd imagined. He became instead a complicated figure, someone people spoke of softly, sometimes with anger, sometimes with pity. When he returned to court, when the papers printed the dry lines about his sentence, I felt an odd mix of vindication and melancholy. Justice had carried its own cost dot in the long view. What changed most was me. The months of planning, the nights of cataloging offenses, the cheap thrill of seeing him uncomfortable, they taught me about the weight of carrying someone else's ruin. They taught me that vengeance can numb you as easily as it frees you. That triumph can come laced with compassion if you let it. And that sometimes the noblest act is the quiet one, making the world safe again, without glorifying the harm you caused to get there. In quieter moments now. When I walk past his empty porch and the wind moves through the brittle flags he used to hang, I let myself remember small things that had nothing to do with him. My mother humming as she loaded the dishwasher. My sister's ridiculous laugh at a sitcom, the way light pools on the kitchen table in the late afternoon. Those small images saved me from becoming someone who lived only for retribution. There are nights when I still imagine him, not as a caricature of evil, but as a man trapped in the architecture of his own cruelty. I wonder if behind the scowl and the threats and the barricades, there was a man who once wanted something different and didn't know how to reach for it. Those thoughts make me uneasy because they complicate my satisfaction. But maybe that's the point. Real victories rarely sit cleanly in one moral box. They sit messy and human, and we have to live with them. If there is a lesson in this, it isn't a vindictive one. It's this: when systems don't protect you, people find ways to protect themselves. Sometimes those ways are clumsy and morally gray. Sometimes they are pragmatic and necessary. What mattered most to me, in the end, wasn't the triumph of making the old man uncomfortable. It was reclaiming the small, everyday freedoms he'd stolen, the right to walk in my yard without being watched, the right for my sister to mow the lawn without feeling terror, the right for my mother to put out a laundry line without scanning for binoculars. I also learned that revenge, when turned into community action, can morph into something like accountability. Volunteers and neighbors and cautious officials all played parts that made what I did less about me and more about safety. That doesn't absolve me of feeling guilty for manipulating human kindness to my own ends. It simply means the story is messy, like most human stories are. I can live with that mess because it led to a quieter life. If you ever find yourself facing someone who makes your home a battleground, think twice before you act in anger. Document, talk, and look for ways to marshal community resources. And if you feel the pull toward personal revenge, recognize that victory can come in many forms. Sometimes it's a single, satisfying payback, but more often it's the gradual rebuilding of a safe, ordinary life. If this story hit you, whether with anger, relief, or uneasy questions, let me know in the comments. Share your own neighbor from hell stories, and if you haven't already, please like and subscribe for more long-form true justice tales every week. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Sometimes the quiet victories are the best ones.